Hello and welcome to the Indy Author Podcast. Today, my guest is Kristen Tate. Hey, Kristen, how are you doing?
Hey, Maddie, I'm great. How are you?
I am doing great. And just to give our listeners and viewers a little bit of background on you, Kristen Tate has been a freelance editor for a decade, helping authors transform their work from rough draft to finished book. She has a PhD in English from Columbia University with a focus on publishing history. She's the author of Novel Study, Decoding the Secrets and Structures of Contemporary Fiction, and writes a regular newsletter full of craft advice and encouragement for authors. And first, I am really looking forward to talking to you about how to become a better writer by becoming a better reader, because one of the ways that we interacted was through your wonderful book club. And I have to say that I really did appreciate, I think that's the way I learn best. I absorb craft advice best if I'm with other people who are talking about craft best practices or pitfalls that they've seen. So, just talk a little bit about what led you to this idea about becoming a better writer by becoming a better reader.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you were able to participate in that. And I think that is true for so many writers that they actually learn craft a little bit better if they are away from their own manuscript and can look at some other writing. And if we can kind of read some great books along the way, all the better. So, this novel study project started really because I wanted to become a better editor. And I spent actually a year reading. I read one craft book a week, and I kind of set myself a project, and I reviewed them. I put them in my newsletter, and I got to the end of that year and I was like, I still feel like I don't really understand when I pick up a book that I think is masterful. I still don't feel like I have a handle on what makes it that way. It still feels fuzzy to me. And so I thought, okay, you know what I'm going to do next is do what I was trained to do in grad school. And I am just going to take a book apart. I'm just going to analyze it to death and see what I can learn from it. So I spent another year kind of doing that and writing about that. And that turned into my novel study book. And then my next idea was I would love to do this in a group setting. And so that's what I did last year. It was kind of themed around bestsellers. So we picked a book off the current bestseller list, and I nominated three and we voted on one. And then we all read them together as a group. And I wrote about them, and I do a kind of intense story spreadsheet for each novel. But what I found was that we have a lot of excellent craft books that tell us about formulas, and these can be so helpful. Like John Truby's book, and I think it's called Anatomy of Fiction. There's Jessica Brody's Save the Cat book. There's Story Grid. I found all of these valuable. I think they're so, so helpful for writers who, especially, are just getting started and just like facing the blank page or starting to flesh out a story idea and just need to know, like, what might the next moves for this plot look like? But when you kind of get beyond that, and for me as an editor, I'm looking at a story spreadsheet I've made for a book, for example, and I know something's not quite right. And I need to figure out what advice to give. This is where the thing about novels are unique in the same way that every child is unique, right? And as a parent, I know that what works for one child is not going to work for another. And I think that's very true of books. And so, what I found when I kind of started digging into these novels is really exciting. Like, the formulas are really helpful, but when you actually sit down and examine a novel, they all work in pretty different ways. And so, by reading them and studying how they work, it just opens up the possibilities. It makes it feel really infinite. And that's exciting, I think, for authors and for editors.
If someone is reading a book that has gotten, let's say, both critical and popular acclaim, and so it's a good model to use, then I think that a lot of times people look at those kinds of books and what they're emphasizing is the commonalities, like the story grid or the ways in which they're similar. And so someone can take a template in a sense. I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but they can kind of make a template from it and then they can apply it to their own work. But if they're very different, what are the pros and cons of reading books that are succeeding because of their differences? And then how can that be applied to a person's writing work?
Yeah, I think here, this is where like the kind of the study part comes in. I really like to take a book apart in a lot of different ways. I feel like when you think about book groups, a lot of book groups stay at kind of the theme level. And that's fine. And like there, we can kind of talk more about different book groups and, they serve a lot of different functions. For me, when I'm approaching a book that I really want to learn from, I try to get as specific as possible, right? And think about what are kind of tools and techniques I can extract from this book. So it's not really about the book itself. It's about, say, looking at an action scene, for example, and knowing that I'm going to have an action scene in my novel. Like, where does this author speed up and where do they slow down? Where are they focused on external action and where are we seeing the internal thoughts of the characters? So, like, really drilling down into like, what do you want to learn? Like, you might come to a novel with a specific question of like, I have 5 different point of views, and I don't know how to balance them all or manage them all. So then you go pick up a few books that have sprawling multiple point of view setups or a book with mixed chronology. Like, these are very complex and actually really tricky. And so reading a few will give you a sense of, okay, these here are a few examples of how I could do it. So you're kind of reading for the tool and the technique and less for the what is really happening on the page there, right? Or kind of generalities from the novel.
I think that's great advice when someone is going to a popular and well reviewed book for a particular question. And then I think there's also just this sense of we're all reading all the time as writers, and we might not be reading with the analytical approach front of mind. And so we're not looking for a particular answer. We're just kind of letting it wash over us. Do you have advice about how people can optimize that kind of experience and learn valuable writing lessons from that?
Yeah, I mean, before I get into that, I will say I think all reading is helpful because you do, even if you don't spend another moment thinking about what you read, like the bones of the story will kind of just sink in and be part of your kind of writerly intuition about here's how a story can work. And I think too, as writers, when we're, and as editors too, is when we're kind of looking at the bones of the story and we're in there, we're like in the weeds, we're looking at kind of words and like moving them around. And I think we forget sometimes that, like, for a reader, the story is your experience the story like over time, right? In the same way, I mean, there's differences, but like the same way, like you sit down and watch a movie, right? That's how a reader experiences a story. And so reminding yourself of what the reader's experience is really helpful. So, that applies to any kind of reading we do. When it comes to like how to approach learning, I think rereading is really the answer, right? Especially if you have the patience to do one reading, and especially if this is a book that just amazed you, or delighted you, you love something about it, there's something you can learn from this book, really pretty immediately sitting down and going straight back to it. And here's one of the tricks you can do is actually shift formats. So for the Novel Study Book Club, what I found myself doing was doing my first kind of read on audio and just letting it kind of wash into me and not thinking too much about, I was just thinking about my experience as a reader slash listener there. And then I did a slower read, either in print or on my Kindle, and took notes. So you can kind of do a few things to kind of shift yourself into that active analytical reading mode. And a lot of them are just like physical and practical. So if you're reading on a device, get ready to highlight. Also have like a notes app open or maybe a notebook on the side. If you're reading in print, tell yourself like this is your study version of this book and let yourself mark it up or have some sticky notes there because one of the problems for us novelists and editors who work on novels is like they're so big, right? It takes us many, many hours to work our way through a novel. And one of the tricks is that like we kind of forget what we read by the time we get to the end. And so what you're doing when you're studying is leaving little breadcrumbs for yourself about this is something I want to come back to once I have the whole structure in my head. Maybe it's just like a sentence and I want to figure out what makes a sentence so great? Or, then coming back to a scene and kind of seeing what kind of ending does it have? Where's the climax of the scene? Looking at it some more. So kind of leaving some breadcrumbs for yourself about what you want to look at even more closely after you finish that second read.
Yeah, a tip that I've seen, I've never implemented myself, and I actually can't remember if this came up in the sessions that you were hosting, is the idea of having different colored Post-it notes and then tabbing depending on, "Oh, I love how the sentence was worded," is sort of a different thing than, "I like how this chapter ended," or, "This person does a really good job of handling the dialogue among, multiple people in a scene." Is that something that I internalized from something you had said?
I think that's probably somewhat different, but I think that is a really great tactic. One of the ways I like to kind of approach both editing and analyzing stories is thinking about three different levels. So thinking about story level, scene level, and sentence level. And so I can imagine having three different kind of pen colors or post-it note colors for those levels, because then, especially for story level, you can kind of go through and then look back again at all of those markings. And that'll give you just a guide to doing that analysis. Because when you really sit down and look at some of the story shapes, they're often quite different from some of the formulas we've seen. And it's just really, as I said earlier, it's a delight to see how many different things can work.
Yeah, I was just I'm not positive I'm gonna find a good way to tie this into the conversation, but earlier today, I was on a sprint with a couple of fellow authors, and we were mentioning that concept of writing the book and then eliminating the first chapter as, sort of a common
Mm.
way of avoiding some unnecessary exposition and things like that. And I think that's something that's difficult if you're looking at a book and you're trying to explicitly learn something from it for your own writing, is that it's hard to make that transition. Like, you might read a book that jumps right in, the person has probably followed that advice about just eliminating the first chapter, but knowing whether that's the right thing to do. I mean, I guess that part of the answer I give myself is you need to be sure that the part of your reading is in your own genre and subgenre, because, eliminating the first chapter might be great in a thriller, but not may not be as good in like a cozy mystery. And so do you have advice about the kind of lessons that writers should ignore when they're reading as not as a learning experience, but as just a pleasurable reading experience?
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of kind of conventional craft advice that writers should ignore. I mean, one that bugs me is Stephen King very famously has this whole like anti-adverb diatribe. And if you look at it again, he actually doesn't say that you should eliminate all adverbs. He's just saying like, maybe you get one per page. So,
Yeah.
and I think people have gone overboard with things like that. But, we also see like prologues are a really great example. People have really strong feelings about like pro and con about prologues and openings in general. Like every single book that I study, I always analyze the opening because openings, they're the most important and they're the hardest to get right for exactly that, what you were saying. It's really hard to know what your story is, right? As a writer, it's harder to judge how to invite the reader into it. So, one thing that I find really helpful is to think about, all right, what is opposite, right? So, doing this as an analyst and also as a writer and as an editor. So, if I see a book, for example, that does open with a prologue, for example, one that I looked at in my first novel study book was The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin. And the prologue it's masterful. It's kind of stream of consciousness. We are immediately into this deep point of view of this figure who is kind of like the avatar for this whole book. And we actually are not in his point of view again until the very end of the novel. So looking at that, thinking about why it works, and then asking yourself, well, what if this wasn't here? What are the other possibilities? And sometimes that is easier to see again when you're looking at someone else's work rather than your own. And I often it's not so black and white as this is clearly right and this is clearly wrong. So it's just a matter of thinking about your ideal reader. Is your ideal reader going to want a really fast start? Or Are you trying to cultivate a reader who is willing to go a little slower? Another book I looked at was The Searcher by Tana French, and she writes mysteries. I would call them mysteries rather than thrillers, and she skews a little bit more literary. And that The Searcher in particular is a very slow start. We don't really kind of understand like who the dead body is until several chapters in. And for her, like I think that was a really deliberate choice. She wants readers who will have the patience and really savor the beautiful sentences on the page and really have the patience for this kind of gradual and quite beautiful character portrait that she's drawing. So a lot of it is going to be then thinking about how do I want to invite my ideal readers into this book? What are they going to be looking for and what's going to hook them?
Well, it's interesting to be a member of a book group because it's clear that the very things that appeal to one set of readers are the things that don't appeal. You can have a group of people who are all, love a genre or have kind of similar sensibilities, and one will call out the slow start as a pro, and one will call out the slow start as a con. And so I guess the other learning there is you're never going to please everybody, and so at some point you just need to decide what is appropriate for you and do the best you can within that.
Yeah. And I think taste is like one of the big things that you're cultivating when you are doing any kind of reading. But also this analytical stuff too. And this is how we kind of distinguish ourselves from one another. I don't care for this. Okay, well, figure out why. Why did you, or sometimes it's more visceral. Like, that definitely happened in the novel study group. And it's fascinating to see like, why did you hate this? I'm thinking about, we read Wild Dark Shore by Charlotte McConaughey, and I'm not going to do spoilers, but people had visceral reactions to the ending of that novel. And so it's really fascinating to think about, okay, what are you responding to there? And then what does this tell you about what you want to do as a writer? And those can be kind of guiding lights for you. Just knowing sometimes it's hard to know what our own taste is until we see something we hate, right? And then we can say, okay, not that. So what's the opposite of that?
Yeah. Yeah, one thing that I found, one of the arguments that I would often have with my editor was how obvious to make something. And I would write something and he would say, "Well, can you clarify this for the reader?" And I was like, "I could, but I don't really want to because I'm a reader who doesn't mind thinking, "Eh, I'm curious about that. I can't wait to see like what the real meaning is behind that." Whereas I think other readers are like, now I'm thinking about this other thing and I'm being taken out of the story because I'm distracted by it. And I think that's just one of those ones that there's not a right or wrong. You just got to decide for yourself.
Yeah, I mean, yes, and I would say one of the keys is like always making it. You have to somehow kind of indicate to readers that you know what you're doing, right? That they are in good hands, and this is deliberate, right? That this is a breadcrumb that you're leaving for them, and not a loose plot thread that you forgot about and haven't cleaned up, right? So that is
Yeah.
just kind of part of how you establish trust with readers.
Yeah. So everything you're saying makes total sense about what writers can learn as readers. But do you encounter resistance? Like, do you ever have writers who intentionally don't want to do that? And if so, why?
Yes, I mean, a lot, actually. I think a lot of it is kind of this anxiety of influence. I think people can be nervous that they'll read something and somehow a writer's style will start to creep into their work in a way that they don't want it to. Or this is more true in nonfiction, but I find it in fiction too. I think there's this fear that someone else has already written their book. But I had this happen recently where actually twice this past year where a writer was convinced that in one case it was a movie that, okay, this is my concept and now it's done. And now people are going to think I copied this. And I happened to be going to see the movie and I was able to report back to this author. I mean, yes, there are these three elements that are exactly the same as what you're doing. And what they did with it is completely different. And I think so there's this fear that is not I understand why it exists, but it's not entirely rational. And I think there's kind of like the plagiarism specter. I think we all are afraid that some little element is going to kind of creep into our brain and then make its way into our book, and someone's going to catch that and accuse us of stealing it. And I don't think that happens. And I think especially it doesn't happen when we're really like leaning into, again, our taste, our uniqueness, what we want to bring to the story. That's kind of a way of ironing that out. And then I think the other thing I hear a lot is just time, which I understand 100%. And this is why I think easing into something by doing an audiobook, listening to something as you're moving around doing other things, deliberately trying. I think we all are now, partly because it's a social thing, like we're consuming a lot of film and TV often more than we're reading. And that can be fine too. That can also teach us a lot about story, but it can't teach us about the tools we have as novelists that visual artists don't have, like interiority, for example. I've worked with a few people now who are moving from screenplay to novel, and they just don't have the intuitive sense. They can tell a story. They're really good at plot, great at dialogue. They just don't have an intuitive sense of where to bring in that kind of the inner thoughts of the character to kind of make all of that sing. So I think doing something like joining or starting a kind of craft oriented book group, something like that, something that can give you other reasons to make that time commitment, I think can really help.
I know that when I was in your book group, you would send out your analysis spreadsheet and different ways of looking at it, and I thought, "Holy Toledo, how much time did you spend on that?" Like, if I were to try to create something like that, I would just have to, like, allocate the year to a particular book because it was incredibly detailed, and, I think it's something that not only does not every writer have the ability to do, but maybe doesn't have the time to do. So can you just talk about, like, the approaches you take, the techniques you used, how you used it, and how you would recommend maybe someone who doesn't have that time to invest, or is maybe a very slow reader or whatever it is, how they can approach that?
Yeah, 100%. I will say, so there's a free download on my website where you can actually get my template for my story spreadsheet, which is over the top. And also a kind of workbook that talks a little bit about exactly this question and has a few dozen questions in there. So I do this because I love it, and this is how my brain works. If I can see something in a spreadsheet, or even better yet, on a graph, then I can understand it. I'm very visual, it turns out. You absolutely don't have to do this. Even doing something like, thinking about those three levels. So say maybe you have just finished the audiobook for something, sitting down or even like taking a walk and thinking through, okay, these three levels: story level, scene level, sentence level. Like, what are my takeaways from this book? Like, how does this story work? Where was the kind of like most intense part? Where did I feel like if my iPhone ran out of battery, I would be so upset and having to stop listening? Like, where was that moment? And why was it placed right there? Were there moments where I was bored? Did I have a hard time kind of getting into the novel? And if the author had started with a different scene or mixed the chronology or something like that, would it have been more exciting? Was there a kind of all is lost moment for the protagonist? And if so, about where was that located? And then always thinking about, is there anything on the story level I can apply to my books? And then scene level and sentence level are really easy to do in bite-sized chunks. So one of the things I like to do on the scene level is, and again, this is the over the top version, and I'll start there and then talk the easier version. For each book that I work on, I do a scene study, and I tag every single sentence in the scene with kind of a category. So I know, is this dialogue? Is this action? Is it interiority? Is it backstory? And then look at the percentages, and I just look at where everything falls. I think most of us, what we remember about a scene are those filmable pieces, right? The kind of live scene elements of action, setting, and dialogue. But when you actually look at what's there on the page, there's all this like kind of muscle and sinew underneath that's holding it all together. So even just kind of thinking back through, okay, like what was a scene that I thought was really cool, or what's a scene that kind of is has a shape that is like one of my scenes, or what is like the showstopper scene in this book, and going back and rereading it and just maybe underlining everything that's not action and dialogue and just looking at, okay, what else is in there? Because I think that's the stuff that becomes, especially if it's done well, it kind of becomes invisible. And so somehow we've like all of these really important backstory pieces, or like something really key about the character, or a theme statement, they've soaked into us and we kind of haven't even noticed, right? And so it's a little magic trick that the author has done. And if you look at it, you can see exactly how they constructed it. And sentences are the easiest of all, right? So if you just have a commonplace book and just write down a sentence or underline or highlight, and then just go back to those and think about why you love them so much. Like, you know, you don't have to get into the grammar, but looking at like, where's the subject and the verb? What kind of verb is it? Are there any adverbs? Is there an em dash? What's the structure of the sentence? Is it short? Is it long? What are the other sentences around it? Why did this one jump out at me?
Yeah, one of the things I was thinking about as I was preparing for this conversation is that I realized that something that I'm very bad about is that I'll finish a book and I'll immediately pick up another book, and I don't give myself time to noodle on it. And one of the reasons that I wanna give myself time to noodle on it is that I do wanna be more diligent about leaving reviews for books that I like, and I'm just not good about that. I think that writing reviews is kind of like writing marketing copy. There are some people who are good at it, and there's some people who are not, and I'm I'm one of the ones that's not, but I'm willing to give it a shot, and I do wanna support my fellow authors when I've read something that I enjoy. And so I try to slow myself down at least long enough to write a very basic review. And I think that could be an entree to a more methodical and careful consideration that would enable me to capitalize on these lessons that I could be learning that I'm probably not because I'm just moving on to the next thing.
Yeah, that I mean, that's a great way to motivate yourself to do it. I will say one of the things I do, so for books that I've worked on, I put up a kind of like, congratulatory post on my social media, and I just list like 3 things that are my favorite things about the book. And often they're like really tiny. I just put one up recently as a kind of, I guess I would call it travel memoir. And the author wrote a lot about Reeves pheasants. And I didn't know any, like these are wild creatures. You should Google it at some point. These are really beautiful, amazing creatures, and I didn't know anything about it. So sometimes, like, even tiny details like that, like, just thinking about, like, what delighted me about this book, right? And just making that little list and maybe posting that as your review. I think that's a great review. Like, here are 3 things that delighted me about this novel. Any writer would be thrilled to hear about that. And it's, kind of low lift, and also it can draw in readers that I don't think the Reeves pheasants show up in her book description, right? You never know what's going to hook a reader. But then as a craftsperson yourself, thinking more broadly about that list that you made, what does this tell me about, what delights a reader? In the case of the Reeves pheasant, it's the details and making them specific and surprising and veering away from the generic. It wasn't a pigeon. I know a lot about pigeons. I've seen a lot of them. And that people can make a pigeon interesting, but a Reeves pheasant is pretty arresting.
One of the things that always pops into my head when I try to think about those things that struck me that might not have struck anyone else is that I was reading a book, this is years ago, by Kelly Simmons, and she writes a lot about kind of, with a background of sort of like suburban life, their thrillers and mysteries. And she had this one part where a woman goes into a Starbucks or something like that, and she orders one of these drinks that like people would normally make fun of, a very, very elaborate coffee drink. And after you're about to like make fun of her because she's a goofball, because she's ordering this ridiculously complicated drink, this bit about why she does it and how there's this moment in her day where she's having things exactly the way she wants to, and maybe it's the only part of her day where that happens. And I realized that I love parts. I can think back to lots of other books now that I've thought of that, where the thing that I remember about it is taking something that on the surface would be sort of like shorthand for this person is a jerk or this person is evil or this person is bad in some way, and shining a light on it that says, and this is why they're that way, and they're empathetic because of that explanation. So even if you don't see it, uh, the reason I love your idea of if you're writing a review, just pick those things out is that even reminding oneself of those couple of things might unearth a theme that you wouldn't otherwise get to.
Yes, I love that, and I like one way to get into that is to kind of act like a toddler who's just always asking why. Why did she order that drink? And then just keep going. It will tell you something pretty interesting about the book or the character or the theme or the plot.
Yeah. Yeah, I always admire I'm trying to think, I see that you have a Mick Herron book behind you, and I think he's one of the people who does this well, the Slow Horses characters. Every every characteristic of Jackson Lamb, the head slow horse, is what would normally be shorthand for a terrible person. And that's kind of the extreme version of, someone for whom flatulence is a primary characteristic. You don't expect that person to be empathetic, but, uh, and yet he is, and admirable. Not only empathetic, but
Yes.
admirable.
Well, and one of the reasons that works is that's a great example of tension, right? And this is something that readers love because every scene that he is in, and this is true in the novels as well, there's this tension between how gross he is and how and rude, and he seems often very dismissive and uncaring. And yet his actions are saying something different. His actions are always saying that his complete focus is on making sure his team is okay and the country is okay and the bad guys don't win. Right. And so that's the tension that makes him so transfixing, I think.
Yeah. So we've talked about some of the things that one can learn from reading good books, and you could guess what those are based on reviews or sales or ratings or whatever. Do you think that there's a benefit to reading bad books? And if somebody's reading a book and they've gotten to page 50 and it's just they just feel it's badly written, is there any educational benefit to continuing? Or should people be steeping themselves in the good stuff, not the bad stuff?
This is such a great question. And I think, I mean, some of this comes back to like your goals. I do think it can be really educational to read something that is bad or you think is bad. And I guess I want to separate out it's worth paying attention to the message, your internalized messages about what you should or should not be reading, right? And I think this is still so important. I'm thinking about like the heated rivalry moment that's happening right now and people talking about kind of trashy TV or trashy books, right? We have this sense that there's like, good literature, there's the Pulitzer Prize winner, and then there's the trashy literature. And I just would encourage everyone to try to put that aside. Like that is about kind of class and status, even if you don't realize it. And you can learn a lot from, romance writers in particular have to kind of pull off, to kind of use the hockey metaphor, they have to pull off a hat trick in every book because we know the ending. We don't know the particulars, but we know the ending. We know where this is going. And yet they have to keep us interested all the way through. So I do really encourage people to kind of try to put aside their preconceptions about what a book might be and to read, if you're writing literary fiction, read some genre fiction. If you're writing romance, read some sci-fi or vice versa, read some literary fiction. So I do really encourage people to read outside of their specific genre. That said, I also like life is short. If you hate something, I think not finishing it is fine or speed reading. It can be really interesting actually to read the first 50 pages, hate something, realize you don't want to finish it, and then, all right, spend 15 minutes. If you were going to complete this book, how would you complete it? And then speed through, like maybe just randomly hit a couple chapters, see what's going on, and then read the ending and see what happens. That can be a really instructive exercise. And then again, kind of as I was saying earlier, think about this as like you understanding more about your taste. And understanding more about your taste will help you be a better writer and be more you. So try to really articulate, like, what did you hate about this book? Like, what is making you itchy? I'm not going to name them, but I definitely had books that I read this past year that were just not my thing. And it was really instructive for me to think about what was making me want to put it down or what was I reacting to. Sometimes that told me something about craft, and sometimes it just told me something about myself that I already knew and I needed to remember. Oh, I just really hate this trope. And this is having to do with like my own personal backstory, right? Good to know.
Yeah. Yeah, I know a couple of years ago, well, a number of years ago now, when rapid release was more of a thing, and I'm not a rapid release person, but, I was hearing how remunerative rapid release could be. So I went on some genre social media group or whatever, and I said, "Can someone give me the name of a rapid release author who's writing in this genre that, that you think is good?" And so I got a name and I got one of her books and I was reading through it and I realized that I think that the way this person was enabling rapid release, and this might just be like what everybody does, is that there wasn't a lot of color commentary. And so the character would walk into a bar, she'd go over to the bar, she'd talk to the bartender, and she'd leave. And what I wanted was she walked into the bar, she looked around. It was a honky tonk bar. It was like a chic bar or whatever. And I wanted to know like what everybody in the bar was drinking and was like the bartender friendly or not friendly and what kind of drink did she order. And so all that the details that being left out would enable someone to write that scene very quickly was what I was missing. But I could also understand that for someone who is primarily reading for plot, then that could be very attractive because they're not saying, "Oh my god, I don't need to know what the bartender was wearing." And so one of those things where then I could see what this person's goal was and that it was very different than mine as both a reader and writer. But I could still read it and say, "Well, that was a page turner," because I was curious to find out what happened next.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so instructive. And I feel like one of the things that we're learning from kind of the rise of self publishing and certain indie authors breaking through is that there are so many niche audiences that who knew that they were all out there. And so I think, again, if you're using your own tastes and your own desires as the guiding light, I feel like you can trust that there is going to be an audience out there who is going to want what you're doing. If you're being authentic to what you want, it's just then it's a matter of, then there's the marketing problem of how do you find those people? But I think you can trust that they're out there.
Yeah, every once in a while I'll hear from so in one of my series, the Engineer series, Anne has become friends with a Philadelphia police detective, and I always get people saying, "Or Anne and the Philadelphia police would hook up anywhere." That's like, "Oh god." Like, I don't even wanna go there because I would be so bad at writing any romantic stuff. But I did have a writer write to me one time and say, "I am so glad that you write books where the ending doesn't depend on the woman getting together with a guy." And I was like, "That's really all I need to hear, because if there's one person out there that enjoys that approach, then I'm happy to be writing for them and just temporarily frustrate everyone who's waiting for poor Anne to have a date at some point."
I love it.
Um,
Stick to your guns on that.
yes, I think I will. Well, just from a skills point of view, nobody wants me going there. Um, so we've talked one of the things I think is really valuable about something like a book club is that I think it can help you talk through or understand some of these questions. Is this a personal preference or is it a true like craft quality preference? Or I need to have a conversation in order to sort through some of these things in my mind. So if people are intrigued by this idea of having this experience of analyzing a book with other readers and maybe with other writers, do you have any suggestions for how people should go about that, creating that kind of group and creating that kind of momentum within it?
Yeah, I will say it can be hard. I think the first thing you need to do is assemble I would say a small group of people who have the same goals, right? Who want a kind of craft focused group and not a kind of wine and cheese and gossip group, which is a delight, but it's a different group. So you really want people who have the same goals that you have. I think unfortunately, like a group like that really does need a leader. So if you're the person kind of initiating this group, you might just go in knowing that it's going to be up to you to kind of shape the norms for this group starting off. Once you establish those, often then you can rotate it around, or you can do the work up front to say, how is this going to work? And then, just kind of having a rhythm and a schedule and a routine. But I think what really helps when it comes to the conversation is to have some questions prepared ahead of time. And again, this is kind of like you as a leader having a plan there. You can also solicit them. That started happening kind of spontaneously in the group that I was running, just so you know, okay, here are like 3 or 4 topics that I know I want to talk about. And then just watch when sometimes there are books that people just have feelings about, like the Wild Dark Shore. People just need to like talk about the ending for a while, and that's great. Let that rip. But just remember that you're there to kind of talk about craft. And so, like, always coming back to the questions of like, how does this work? You can start with, do I like this or do I not like that? That can be like a useful way into the discussion. But if you can get into questions more like, how does this work? Why did the author make this choice? And then that question that's always so generative, I think, is what if this were opposite? What would opposite look like? And does that help us understand this choice?
One thing that I think this was part of your group is that you had discussion areas where people could talk about it was like the spoiler area and the non-spoiler area. That was brilliant. So if you were like halfway through and you're like, "What just happened?" and you wanted to go chat about it with someone, you could do that in the spoiler area, and then you could avoid that if you didn't want that for your own reading experience. That was brilliant.
Yeah, I enjoyed that so much too. It kind of surprised me how much I enjoyed it and just having that space to like finish the book and be able to kind of just talk about those feelings, right? And just thinking about length of time. So I had the gift of a complete weekend to myself this past weekend, and I spent most of it reading The Antidote by Karen Russell. And it probably took me, it's a 500, 400 page book. So it was many, many hours of reading. Had to have been at least 8, and maybe it was 10. And so we can give that kind of time to a novel. And yet movies that hit 3 hours, like, we complain about them or we need a bathroom break, and there's reasons for that. So, like, a movie can only stretch on so long, or it's gotta be kind of chopped up in this more formal way into episodes. And so just thinking about that tension is really interesting. And for me, it also makes me value. I think writers spend a lot of time longing for the things that they don't get, right? Like they want to see this specific showstopper scene on the screen. And I get that. But also, like, the thing that we get instead is we get readers' close attention for quite a long time, 8, 10 hours. And often we get like very, very intimate attention, like people snuggled up in bed, or like we get to be closer, I think, to our audience than sometimes movie makers get to be to theirs.
Well, that would be a fascinating topic, and anything you have to say about story, Kristen, is always just so insightful and so fun.
Yeah.
So, thank you for talking about the idea of using your reading as a way to improve your writing, and please let everyone know where they can go to find out more about you and everything you do online.
Yeah, you can find everything at my business name is The Blue Garret. So thebluegarret.com. And you'll find on there's a free download if you sign up for my newsletter, which goes out twice a month. And that's where my kind of novel study posts show up. I just finished a sequence on What We Can Know, and I'm getting ready to dig back into Barrier of Bones in the Midnight Garden, which is another very long and really fascinating book. So if you want to hear about that, come sign up.
Sounds great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Maddie.